All right, testing one, two, three. Hello. Okay. Testing one, two, three. Welcome. This and that information. 7 November, chapter 10, Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Last time we stared at the fetishism of vulgar and apologetic economics, and it came to some sort of end for the theories of surplus value. I think he's right when Dussel is correct when he talks about theories of surplus value. The current chapter is towards chapter 2 and chapter 3. In this sense, chapter refers to volume or book 2 and 3 of Capital, of Karl Marx's Capital. And you can see that there's this idea of the reflux of money, I think, is actually an important notion, particularly as a question of quote unquote reflux. But anyway, um, and he finally gets to the end of the theories of surplus value and deals with the other kinds of constructions towards the getting a complete version. Note, of course, that uh, in each instance, we're thinking of a much larger construction, and Marx is also at this moment in the manuscripts of 61 to 63. He has this. He revises, the way in which he approaches the entire project. Whereas prior to that, he started the structure of the entire project was from capital. It's still capital, but there something happens, of course, and he revises his ideas, particularly in the context of Volume One, and subsequently, and as we've seen through history, that the front end of Volume One, the Chapter One, as noted by a bunch of folks, is is changed. It's the project begins with commodity instead of capital, and one could say, as I think Dussel suggests, that as a result of looking more closely at all of these different political economists, it's not simply Ricardo and Smith, but rather in thinking in this larger way about developing the question of what counts as a commodity, which in that sense, I think, and I think it's Dussel's point, is this question going all the way back to the Kantian question, Hegel, etc., that we're thinking about categories or new categories, if nothing else, and so it evolves to this commodity question in order to explain the subsequent divisions, particularly the issue of surplus, which is still worth talking about, even if no one else talks about it, or at least conceptually, what counts as surplus value as a way of getting at the question of value, that there are surpluses or whatever. Now, the conceptual way in which we'd approach this is the issue of where the surplus is occurring, and I think for Dussel's purposes, this is the question of dependency. Um, among many other things. And so in the case of North-South, et cetera, we can see that certain ideas are at work, particularly the difference between North-South, center-periphery. All of those are kinds of ways in which we can talk about ways in which value is being necessarily transferred. And the idea of capital export, and it's not simply capital export, of course. It is differences in value that come from capital export. And of course, it's an unequal asymmetric set of exchanges. So therefore, for Dussel's purposes, that's why he's spending all this time trying to figure this out in reference to questions, dependency questions. All right, so this is the quote for the beginning of the last chapter, chapter 9, and it's worth thinking about. That is the formal question, and ultimately it becomes, as we've looked at before, a subsumption question, that the form and reality are not necessarily identical, but the deficiency of classical political economy is the fact that it does not conceive the basic form, the Grundform of capital, that is production designed to appropriate other people's labor as a historical form, but as a natural form of social production. So the whole point of the issue of social relations, the social relationship, the formation of production as social relations, as having a social relation issue, is all sort of there. That's from chapter 9. So there will be several diagrams this time around, and we see further developments on the issues of capital, and volume 2 and 3, which is, Department 1, Department 2, et cetera. The idea of capital being differentiated further in terms of interest-bearing capital, commercial capital, and then industrial capital. Of course, the kind of determinism, as it were, the economism in some ways. And you can see this little dotted line here where rent and sort of, MP questions, right? Means of production is situated within the context of, money, M1, M2, labor, etc. So particularly wage labor. See the defining of wage labor related to capital, which in some ways makes it easier to explain. And also, as even in the current situation now, we can see it as problematic relative to commercial and interest-bearing capital. Anyway, and hopefully the fetishism chapter kind of helps with figuring this out. Now, also consider this kind of construction, and our familiar equation is back, right? MC, C prime, M prime, right? MC, LP, MP, that is a means of production and labor power, production, C prime, and M prime. So we see this sets of divisions and descriptions of the first kind of circuit, the industrial capital circuit, but also the movement into or from industrial capital. And that even historically, we can see how this operates, right? That is, you have General Motors, and then you have the finance component of the company, the auto General Motors, for example, which GMAC, which is actually more important in many ways than the car company itself. And so a further division in terms of diagrams will give us, hopefully, a better sense of, cost, price, etc. And this, as we'll see in this chapter, a kind of way of sort of working through, as I kind of Marx does, and Dussel is trying to do this as well, is to explain the cost price question about costs of production, and that it is kind of a subcomponent in terms of direct and, as it were, indirect costs, and ultimately how it gets to kind of merchant profit as cost of production. This is the B section here in this diagram, etc. And how we get to price of production from that. Anyway, and then a slightly more complicated version of that to see that it is a system of exchanges. And yes, value is sort of located amongst all these matters. So anyway, that's what the reflux question, referring to this kind of interaction among elements, particularly when you think about a money supply, etc. So that's important. And then further on in this chapter by Dussel, we have the movement from the original plan, or the first plan, that is capital in general, commodity, money, capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then to a competition, credit, stock, capital, et cetera, kind of the original, the six-part hope for the project. And then you see that it shifts slightly. January 1863, we see the front end as commodity and money, which is, with all due respect, the kind of where, and not, this is not necessarily talking about MMT, but the fact that money moves forward in the process, or in terms of constructing the project. You can see how he begins to rethink this relative to surplus value, which is really where he heads. And that surplus value, in comparison, begins to take more of the front end of the project. So he's still talking about capital in general and commodity, but it is shoved even further forward relative to the introduction, etc. And then we see the subsequent modifications that come from further work. So it does have actually a history, and Dussel, I think, does a good job of explaining the difference in the plans, and that the text sort of reveals that difference. In terms of the 1861 to 63, particularly the idea where the notebooks on surplus value sort of fit in this sequence, as it were, and so progressive articulation of the definitive plan of parts of volume 1. So all of this is part of, as I've referred to, the kind of front loading of the project into, the volume 1, which is kind of the whole goal of the business, right? The need to get it, in order to get it published. The project has this kind of requirement or structure, and explaining all of the different elements of this. So Marx is fiddling around with all these things, aside from having a real life, and seeing where some of these occur, right? And you can see how accumulation at least gets evolved, and the chapter 6 question will come up, etc. So, right, new discoveries. And we described that yesterday. We're then at the end of the manuscript 61, 63, where thanks to the analysis of the production cost in a definite manner, Marx clarifies the concept of price of production, which only now he distinguishes from cost price as an autonomous category. The price question is on his mind. How is it the difference between production cost and the price of production, and price of production relationship to trying to get to market price, or the differences between in terms of firms and sectors and markets, etc. So, right, chapter 10 towards chapter 2 and chapter 3, that is volume 2 and volume 3 of Capital, notebooks 15 to 18. Just as the surplus value of the individual capital in each particular sphere of production is the measure of the absolute magnitude of the profit, insofar as this is merely a converted form of surplus value, so is the total surplus value, gesamte Mehrwert, produced by the total capital, gesamte capital. Hence, the whole of the class of capitalists, the absolute measure of the total profit of the total capital, whereby profit should be understood to include all forms of surplus value, such as rent, interest, etc. It is therefore the absolute magnitude of value, and therefore the absolute surplus produce, that is the amount of commodities which the capitalist class can divide up among its members under various headings. The empirical or average profit can therefore be nothing other than the distribution of that total profit and the total surplus value represented by it, or the representation of the total surplus labor. So the distribution of that total profit among the individual capitals in each particular sphere of production in equal proportions, the agency through which this calculation is performed, is the competition, right, of capitals with each other. And right there, we're at where Anwar Sheikh is. I mean, all of this, arm waving. And it does take sort of going through all of these things to get there. Anyway, close quote. So that was Marx, pages 99 to 100. Now, Marx passes slowly from the process of production to the process of circulation, Department 1, Department 2, and from the latter, that is the process of circulation, to the unity, the Einheit of the process of production and the process of circulation. The unity of the process, the unity of Department 1 and Department 2. In other words, he gradually moves to the subject of the future volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, which at this moment are still called the third chapter and chapter 2, right? Hopefully that's all clear. A whole set of categories must be developed. Categories which are discussed only slightly, if at all, in the Grundrisse. Footnote 1. 10.1, mercantile capital. Marx discusses mercantile capital at 4 levels. Number 1, prior to the existence of capital as such. Number 2, the contradictory moment of its first appearance. Number 3, subsumed as an internal function of industrial capital as such. And lastly, number 4, relative autonomy as commercial or credit capital. For the moment, he performs this task with terminological variations, which proves that the construction of categories is still an ongoing process. As we've said, at the end of Theories of Surplus Value, the book, or the text, Marx had begun to develop the subject of capital that earns interest. This is that whole point, right, of financial, ultimately to get to, financial capital. That's the reason why we're doing this, which would be the 4th level. When capital enters into the circulation process, namely when the product becomes a commodity, its function is derived from industrial capital as analyzed at the third level. Indeed, at the first level, commercial wealth and interest-bearing wealth are prior to and independent of industrial capital. They are ancient forms, which could have been present in India or the Roman Empire, but at the second level, and since the 17th century, quote, remember my comments on Italian banks, quote, both of them must first be destroyed as independent forms and subordinated to industrial capital. Violence, that is the state, is used against interest-bearing capital by means of compulsory reduction of interest rates, darn the Fed, so that it is no longer able to dictate terms to industrial capital, close quote. This is the MECW 33, pages 464 to 5. It is the time of confrontation. The third level is the monetary, that is the M-C, big M dash big C, or mercantile function of capital itself, that is big C dash M. So here we're finally back to MCM, CMC. The fourth level is when the industrial capital creates a form that pertains to it, independent and autonomous, but dependent on it. That is the credit system, right? So this is all there. As I've tried to crudely analyze it, or crudely analogize it, that is, GM creating GMAC. So anyway, back to the text. In the section on revenue and its sources, Marx had discussed interest-bearing capital, the most fetishized form of capital, for it appears to have no relation whatsoever to living labor. For Marx, interest is part of the distribution of surplus value. Here, it seems that there's no relationship at all with surplus labor and living labor. Marx uses various terms. He refers to commercial capital, or by the German etymological origin, traffic, Handel, right? Handel's capital, and properly in its strong form, Kaufmann's capital, of Kaufmann, the person of the merchant. Merchant capital. All these forms must be distinguished from mercantile capital or commodity capital from money capital, and even from capital that trades in commodities. The Warenhandel capital, or capital that trades with money, right? Geldhandels capital. So, anticipating with regard to the accuracy is still not achieved by Marx. Well, let us see the following diagram, 10.1, which expresses his definite terminology even in capital. In this notebook 15, and starting from the unpublished part, not edited by Kautsky, footnote 2, we find the first extensive study of this problematic in Marxist theoretical life. We will follow, as usual, a strict chronological order. We will not anticipate later developments, footnote 3. The development of the concept of mercantile capital starts with what is not yet capital and ends in the autonomous forms in which surplus value is distributed or transferred, a transfer from surplus value, ein Transfer von dem Mehrwert, page 63, no longer as functions of industrial capital, the only level at which surplus value is produced, but as commercial capital or interest-bearing capital. So, we're trying to solve, as it were, the surplus value question by seeing the difference, that little dotted line I was talking about before, and seeing how it is separated from, or demarcated, as it were, in industrial capital from wages, upon which everything is still located relative to human labor, labor power, etc. But we can see that, if we believe in something like reflux or whatever, that it's constantly moving back and forth. And here is R relative to commercial capital and interest-bearing capital. So while it moves up, the question, of course, comes back as we get, for example, in the housing market, where the reflux occurs, and which is a significant part of, actual real everyday life, unfortunately. First, so back to the text. First, Marx describes the forms prior to capital, that is, the pre-capitalistic usurer or miser, the Wucherer, which is the first form of loan with interest already present. Okay, so this is, this idea of Wucherer is here: the miser, the hoarder, the merchant, the Kaufmann, commodity as commodity, right? So pre-capitalist, and then capital. So this is one way in which we can see that originally we're just simply obsessed with the, money exchanger, flipping over the tables in the temple, blah, blah, blah. Now we see something more, as it were, insidious. How capital comes as, in terms of, this is what Marx is trying to do, is to try to get this commodity idea within the context of the industrial capital to kind of manifest itself, and look at, as others have considered, the autonomous question, money dealing capital versus capital that deals with commodities, and commercial capital in general, Kaufmann's capital or Handel's capital, that, he's trying to work this out in his brain, right? That, that there is capital that is about money and capital that deals with commodities. And the point, of course, as others have pointed out, to our dismay, I suppose, David Harvey et al., the moment when money has a commodity form, as it were, quote unquote. So that's kind of what's going on here. The development of terminology related to money capital and commercial capital, figure 10.2. So we're going from slavery society or feudalism, or the merchant Kaufmann, who obtains profit by means of selling commodities over his purchase price. This form of usury, in which capital does not take control of the mode of production, hence is capital only, formally presupposes pre-bourgeois forms of production as dominant, but is reproduced again in bourgeois society in dominant spheres. The money profit obtained by the merchant or usurer is not really capital. The money profit obtained by the merchant or usurer is not really capital. It emerges from circulation and not from production. It's, the tables are flipped over in the temple. They're not flipped over anywhere else. It presupposes money and commodities, but it does not produce them nor create them. They are movements of mediations between extremes. It does not dominate and presuppose. It does not create. They are two forms of trade, either with money or with commodities, Warenhandel, but they are not capital. They are A and B of figure 10.2, as I just pointed out. Second, Marx discusses the pre-capitalist bourgeois and small agricultural industries. They need Nonetheless, money as a means to purchase or as a means of payment, money appears before them as a fetish. People just obsess about this in problematic or interesting ways, Hudson et al. And this is, why we get to, as it were, MMT. Anyway, back to the text. Sorry. Money, quote, money is absolute, counts for everything. And this all embracing power of money is the power of the usurer, close quote. Now, Marx also studies the pre-capitalistic, mercantilist, and even colonial forms of capital, as he had already insinuated in the theories of surplus value. Third, Marx explains the subsumption of these primitive forms in capital, properly speaking. That is, money is money, Geld als Geld, or commodities as commodities, Ware als Ware, develop into capital. So money is money, or commodities as commodities develop into capital. Quote, commercial capital, Handelskapital, or money as it appears in merchants' wealth, is the first form of capital, i.e. value which proceeds exclusively from circulation, from exchange, preserves, that is the first form of capital, how it preserves, reproduces, and increases itself within it. And thus, the exclusive purpose of this movement is exchange value, close quote. So the whole business there is right there, yes? Capital subsumes inferior forms, but at the same time, coercively, Zwangsweise, coercively destroys them by means of competition and also by means of political power. Only in the fourth place does capital as money, capital als Geld, capital as money appear. Properly speaking, one knows it is capital because it has subsumed living labor's productive force and hence has accumulated surplus value. It is figure C of figure 10.2, which nonetheless is opposed to commodity capital. Quote, a reduplication therefore takes place, at least in appearance, Commercial capital, that is commodity capital, and moneyed capital are on the one hand general formal determinations of productive capital and the particular movements it passes through as commercial capital, commodity trade, and moneyed capital, money trade, are particular functions. Note, this is all exchange, right? And money capital are particular functions which productive capital performs in its process of reproduction in both of these forms. As particular forms of productive capital in general, they also become the spheres of particular capitals, particular spheres of the valorization of capital. Particular spheres of the valorization of capital. Now, this is the whole point, if you want to extrapolate, close quote. This is the point at which, you begin to think, well, okay, this explains the concept of political economy. That is this, Department 1, Department 2, the spheres of capitals, right? The central finite curve. Anyway, back to the text. These are completely the subject matters of future book 2 of Capital, right? Department 1, Department 2. The mere dealing with money, Geldhandel, of the usurer is not equivalent to money capital, Geldkapital. Similarly, the mere dealing with commodities, Warenhandel, of the merchant is not the moment, function, stage, or arena of productive capital called commodity capital, Warenskapital. Both pre-capitalistic movements are developed by subsumption as moments or determinations of capital itself. The first moment of capital is the one that purchases M-C. The second moment is the one that sells C-M. Remember, M-C-M, right? Big M, big C, big M. Both are, in a broad sense, mercantile or commercial capital. This would be the fifth aspect, which we shall discuss. And here it is here where Marx advances towards the constitution of his main categories. So this is a long way to get there on the one hand. On the other hand, it's historic, right? You see it in, and it's not, the moment at which it occurs is, highly problematic, of course. But I think if you look as others have, right, people like Michael Hudson, et cetera, looking at the history of money, the evolution of money, that's kind of where we are. And it is here where Marx advances towards the constitution of his main categories. The passage from the product P to commodity C logically poses certain problems, such as the one of passage from surplus value into profit, their respective rates, the fall of profit rate, etc. But we now obtain new clarity regarding a central issue. Quote, the industrial production price of one commodity always enters into the cost price of the other. Even when the industrialists exchange directly without the interposition of merchants, is a common question, that when people ask about, you do your basic description of, how Marx operates and the means of production, blah, blah, blah. And, you begin to try and figure out, well, the difference between, constant capital and variable capital, and then ultimately the difference between, fixed capital and labor. As regards all the other commodities which enter into the price of production of his own commodity, their cost price, hence the costs of his production, appear to him as determined by the price of production, and profit therefore appears as an element which enters into the price of production, not as a result which emerges from it. Okay? So, and this is an important moment, and it is, as it were, an accounting moment. Close quote. Pages 36 to 37. As one can see, we have passed into another moment of the development of the concept of mercantile capital. It is no longer about the passage of product with its cost, price, and surplus value into commodity with its price of production, including the cost transportation, but about the passage of the commodity of industrial capital into another commodity, either another industrial capital or commodity capital, which will constitute a sixth question. Okay, see, we're up to multiple questions and ultimately multiple categories. Indeed, Marx now reaches a greater clarity regarding the category of price of production because he has to compare it with an autonomous or independent capital, not any longer as a function or phase of industrial capital, but as a particular commercial or mercantile capital. Moment B as in boy, of figure 10.2. In this case, the following situation can arise. Quote, the magnitude of the difference between the buying price or the merchant, the selling price of the producer, and the selling price, the buying price and the selling price of the merchant, still at the merchant level, the buying price of the consumer, the difference between the buying price and the selling price of the merchant. Close quote. Here we have only the difference between the buying price or what is the same to the producing capital, it's the cost price, and the selling price or the price of production, the difference between cost price and price of production, CP and PP. close quote. In other words, surplus value is distributed between the profits of industrial capital and commercial capital. The price of production refers to the final selling price of the merchant, who, when buying the commodities, pays the producer its value, less the commercial profit. This type of relationship of exchange now gives Marx more possibilities to understand the difference between industrial cost price, that is the buying price of the merchant, plus mercantile profit, and price of production, the final selling price. Now, if we take our little example of GM, you have GM, GMAC, and then you have dealerships, and of course, all of the attendant issues. In figure 10.1, the commodity C of the industrial capital has for the producer a selling price, SPP, of 10.3, which is the buying price for the merchant, the profit obtained by the merchant in M2 of figure 10.1, right? Remember M2, M1, M2, M3, or mercantile profit, MP of figure 10.3, must be considered as a cost of the producer. That is surplus value obtained through distribution. Let me break here for a moment. And this is this issue of transaction costs, which come back to us, Williamson, et cetera, right, in the 20th century. This is clarified here by Marx for the first time in a definite way. It is the dialectical passage of capital that produces surplus value, that is industrial surplus value, into mercantile capital that earns profit by the transfer of industrial surplus value. So they're not identical, but surplus value moves, right, in that particular same sort of way. Not identical, but similar. And of course, I think with all due respect, you break here again and say, well, this is this not, and we could obviously do this in another context, and we don't have time to do it here, but is this that question of value that Althusser is addressing at the question of ideology? And of course, transferring it much further, and I haven't done the work on this, but I assume it's sort of there, is if you go to, Hart and Negri and Deleuze and Guattari, it is still this kind of cognitive value that is kind of at work at the mass level. Anyway, back to the text. Quote Marx: mercantile capital therefore creates neither value nor surplus value. That is to say, not directly. The profit which mercantile capital brings in is therefore merely a part of the surplus value which is created by total productive capital. Mercantile capital does not function in the actual process of production, but in the process of reproduction of the commodity, of which the process of circulation forms a section of its own. A section of its own. Just as the industrial capitalist is an agent of capitalist production, or productive capital personified, so the merchant is an agent of capitalist circulation, capitalist production versus capitalist circulation. In fact, a personification of circulating capital, close quote, pages 62 to 63. So you can sort of see where his brain is at, right? He's trying to work through this price thing, but price is not necessarily, it is identical to value at a certain scale, but at a kind of a real scale, that is in a mass scale in that sense, they're not identical. They diverge or converge in various ways. So anyway, I'm going to end after I describe the seventh question, I suppose, still a seventh question, interest-bearing capital development of the misers forward as capital, that is the money capital or monetary capital developed as capital that trades in money, moment A of figure 10.2, or interest-bearing capital of figure 10.1 that obtains profit from money M3. It is neither the forward of the pre-capitalist miser, Scrooge McDuck, capital money to purchase M-C, nor as sale C-M, but the autonomous or independent capital as the more developed money as means of payment, hence the credit system. See, we're back to Italian banks again, which acts within the reproduction of the total capital in order to shorten the circulation time. Quote, capital in money dealing, Geldhandel, is a particular kind of commercial capital alongside capital employed in commodity dealing, the Warenhandel. The one is a development of commodity capital, the other a development of money capital, right? Recall what we've looked at in Harry Cleaver and David Harvey, right? Or the one is a development of capital as commodity, the other of capital as money, right? This is that critical moment of the money commodity. Both are merely forms and modes of existence of productive capital present in the circulation process, which have attained an independent role, the independent role. Close quote. This is interest-bearing capital. Interest is nothing but a distribution of the surplus value of industrial capital, and all has also to be added to the production cost of industrial capital. Distribution of the surplus value of industrial capital, and also has to be added to the production cost of industrial capital. Lastly, Marx also discusses the turnover of capital. Remember, we've talked about this before. The accumulation of capital in the reproduction process. In this sense, one says that the circulation process is a phase of the total process of reproduction. We will discuss this subject later. As we can see, Marx has studied here the problems of the future, volume 1, that is primitive accumulation or original accumulation, volume 2, money capital, commodity capital, reproduction, and volume 3, cost price, production costs, commercial capital, and interest-bearing capital. It all has a kind of logic with emphasis on the mercantile aspect of these problems. Okay, I'm going to stop there. This is the end of 10.1, Dussel's chapter 10. Couple of diagrams worth studying, worth thinking about, and we will discuss this perhaps on Monday. We'll see. Now